Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love history, travel, and finding out how people live. Today we're beginning a tour in Barcelona, a formerly rather grubby, rundown port city that has always had potential and decided to capitalize on it. The city was substantially rebuilt and has managed to keep all, or at least most of its original charm. This is my third visit here if you count a fleeting overnight stay and change of trains back in 1970 on the way to someplace else. I was underwhelmed by Fascist Spain in 1970, but that was then and this is now. They've come a long way. The aerial image you see here is a view of the main tourist drag called Les Ramblas, which leads all the way from the port area to the Plaza Catalunya. Walking along the street will give you a flavor for several of the main neighborhoods here in the city. Next time, we'll begin looking at some of these delightful neighborhoods in depth. But for today, kick back and get ready to have your eyeballs entertained with me, the armchair traveler. Barcelona has been a going concern for over 2,000 years. It's old. It predates the capital of Madrid by more than 1,000 years and is fiercely proud of its heritage, its customs, its culture, and its language. Invaders, conquerors, occupiers, they come and they go, attracted by the excellent harbor and more recently by the economic potential of the area. Legend tells us that a man named Hamilcar Barca, who was the father of the far more famous General Hannibal, actually established a settlement here and named it Barcanon, more or less after himself. Any would-be conqueror in his right mind would have stopped here, and Roman Emperor Augustus was no exception. He established a colony which he renamed Barcino in about 15 BCE. The Romans put in walls, gates, and more, parts of which are still here. In the heart of the Roman imperial era settlement, that fact is remembered with this rather exuberant marker, which reads Barcino. Barcelona is walkable but does have an excellent subway and bus system. Parts of it feel like a maze, other parts of it look like the 20th century, and some of it is even more modern looking. In many cases, medieval cities were demolished and replaced with newer, more modern areas with grid-planned street layouts and much wider streets. Barcelona has managed to retain elements of the old area and has added the new. My experience tells me that the best way to sample it is to work your way uphill, which means you get to go back downhill to your hotel, starting at the harbor. There are plenty of ways to split up the city, but for this video blog series, I've settled on an introduction, you're here now, and then visiting the port, beaches in Barceloneta, swinging north more or less from Christopher Columbus Memorial along Las Ramblas to the Plaza Catalunya, checking out La Sagrada Familia and some of the more fabulous Modernista architecture nearby, and making a bus excursion all the way north to Park Güell. We'll visit each area in greater detail in coming weeks. Food and beverages are going to be a part of this plan, as well as plenty of sunscreen, so let's start walking. Barcelona's harbor area is where many tourists first meet up with the city. The area today extends a great deal further than just the old harbor, which they call Ciutat Vella in Catalan, and includes an attractive and quite upscale waterfront area that was essentially rebuilt as part of the enormous urban renewal program before the Barcelona Olympics in 1992. Before that time, much of the harbor area was made up of rundown warehouses and some factories. 1970s era Judy, tall, blonde, and obviously not Spanish, would have avoided the area like the plague. Today it boasts an enormous shopping center, an aquarium, and an extension of La Rambla called Rambla de Mar, a pedestrian walkway that connects La Rambla to the old harbor. This is one of the busiest ports in Europe and includes a cable car that'll whisk you up to Montjuic, at least on days when it isn't too windy. There is considerable and growing controversy about the number of tourists visiting the city, as there are in so many other old cities in Europe. Cruise passengers seem to be a particular target. Recently, there have been some fairly ugly incidents with attacks by locals, apparently, although in the age of 24/7 social media, you never know who exactly is behind what. On tourists just minding their own business and spending money in stores, bars, and restaurants along Las Ramblas. Spending money is something the city needs for it to survive and thrive, but the local population's beef about overcrowding is also legitimate, at least in my opinion. Eventually, the local authorities will be forced to do something about the crowds. I expect there will be restrictions on the number and timing of cruise ship entries in the future. Barcelona has a long and proud history, and Catalonia has its own culture, customs, and language, which are quite distinct from the rest of Spain. Kings, dictators, and even the present government have attempted to squash, or at least rein in, the Catalans since the Wars of the Spanish Succession, when King Philip V issued a Nueva Planta, decrees in 1716 which aimed to concentrate the Spanish state and suppress regional identities, including the Catalan language and institutions. Those decrees abolished the autonomous institutions in Catalonia, imposed Castilian Spanish as the official language of government administration, and significantly restricted the use of Catalan in public life. This marked the beginning of a long history of efforts to suppress the Catalan language, which would recur in various forms throughout Spanish history. It was essentially a culture war. So far, however, no one has managed to suppress them, at least not in the long run. You see these narrow balconies all over the city. They're functional as well as decorative, with windows opening from the floor to ceiling to let in light and air. However, most are far too narrow to sit on. About the best most people can do is put out a few potted plants. The flag in the photo is the regional Catalan flag. The Catalans retain a healthy sense of linguistic and cultural identity, and a Catalan separatist movement has been simmering against the national government in Madrid for centuries. Barcelona was on the wrong end of the fight with Generalissimo Franco and his troops, so after the Spanish Civil War, when he had full control, he reinstated all of the restrictions against the Catalans. After Franco's death in 1975, a new constitution recognizes a linguistic plurality and allowed for regional languages. Catalan was reintroduced into the school system and became compulsory in Catalan schools. Almost everyone a tourist is likely to run into will speak Spanish as well, and also English. If you speak Spanish or French and are sitting in a cafe and hear chit-chat you literally cannot understand, most likely what you're listening to is Catalan. The local government stubbornly flies the Catalan flag on the city council building in the Plaza Jaume. As I was preparing this video blog, one of the leaders of the Catalan separatist movement, a man named Carles Puigdemont, who had been living in exile and on the run in Belgium for years, re-emerged rather surprisingly in Barcelona, gave a rabble-rousing speech about Catalan independence, and then vanished. Carles actually tried to lead an insurrection, and he was charged by the Spanish government, which tried to arrest him, but he managed to pull a fast one and escape the country. The local gossip is that Carles managed to pull that vanishing act because someone, or probably several someones, inside the Catalonian local government helped him. This is not the sort of thing to endear any of them to the national government. Rambla means stream in Arabic. This area used to be a drainage ditch leading downhill from just outside the Roman-era city walls to the sea. Comparing my photo with a black and white shot made in 1905 shows just how little, in some respects, the street has changed. Many Catalan towns have streets named Rambla. Today, Barcelona's Las Ramblas, arguably the best known, at least to me, has a stream of humanity. This is the main drag between the Plaza Catalunya and the harbor, gently sloping downhill from the top, or so the guidebooks claim. The last time I was here, I hoofed it uphill. Definitely a dumb move on my part, dragging my suitcase from the harbor. Aside from being the main drag, with all the shops, cafes, bars, and restaurants, Las Ramblas actually boasts quite a bit of public art. This first photo shows you the wavy pavement, which is designed to remind us that this used to be a stream, along with a Jean Miro mosaic in red, white, and blue. Miro was born and grew up right here in the Gothic quarter. The black arrow is supposed to represent an anchor, a reminder of the city's attachment to the ocean and a welcome to visitors arriving by sea. I took this photo at 9:30 in the morning and I was grateful for the shade. It was already hot. Many cities are setting up pedestrianized streets in the downtown area, but I think some of them don't take it very seriously. Cars are let in at certain hours, reasonable enough in my opinion to allow for delivery trucks, but little if any effort is made to keep them out the rest of the time. What you see here are serious traffic barriers. Cars and delivery trucks are allowed on the side streets, but aren't supposed to jump the curb to the center. The trees are another barrier. Although meant to entice pedestrians, and it does, this street is surprisingly pedestrian unfriendly. The trees shade the walkway quite a bit, but the only place to sit down is in a restaurant, cafe, or bar. There are almost seats, like these appendages on the base of the lampposts, but I wouldn't try it. This is actually part of a water fountain, the only free one in the area. The base is a water tap called the Fountain of Candlelettes. The legend says that if you drink from this fountain, you'll come back to the city one day. The Gothic Quarter is the area in and around the cathedral and is the oldest section of the city. Roman builders built for keeps. You can still see parts of ancient Roman walls, towers, gate, and even a fragment of the aqueduct. The only way this stuff went away is if someone deliberately tore it down, usually to repurpose the stone. The engraving shows us how archaeologists believed the area looked when it was new. The two towers were originally posts that supported one of the main gates to the city. This final photo shows you the tiny remains of the aqueduct. There's enough left to allow you to imagine a waterway, which would have run along the top of the arcade and was almost certainly roofed over to protect the water quality. Barcelona's cathedral is a magnificent Catalan Gothic structure overlooking a sprawling square. It mostly dates from the late 13th to the middle of the 17th century, although the front facade, which is so impressive, and the central tower weren't added until the late 19th century. Unlike most churches in Barcelona, it survived the Civil War, mostly undamaged. The full name is the Cathedral of the Holy Cross and St. Eulalia. It honors a Christian named Eulalia, who, like so many other early Christians whose names we also know, was martyred during the persecution of Christians during the reign of Diocletian. The story goes that she was the daughter of the local nobility. The governor, a man named Dacian, arrived in the city to carry out the persecutions. Eulalia came into the city, confronted the governor. He didn't like it. He had her arrested, stripped naked, and beaten. Eulalia apparently prayed to God to take her to heaven, and she did die from her wounds. Another, more gruesome story tells us that she was put into a barrel with shards of glass and rolled down the street until she bled to death. We will visit the church and more when we tour the Gothic Quarter, but for now you can enjoy the cloister, which encloses the Well of the Geese. Visiting here required an additional fee, waiting in line, and going through a rather serious security check, but it was worth the effort. Here is one of the famous and very noisy geese at work. I collect city markets, so I was glad to meet up with this specimen. This is La Boqueria. If you look at the sign above the main entry, you can make out that it says Mercat Saint-Joseph. There's been a market in or near this spot since around the 13th century, although it went up by different names. The current name, they think, might come from the Catalan word boc, which means goat. So La Boqueria would seem to mean a place where goats or goat meat was sold. Construction on this particular building didn't begin until 1840, and the metal roof only dates to 1914 or so. The market features a wide array of fresh produce, meats, seafood, and other delicacies. I bought a bottle of wine here on the way uphill to the hotel, but no more. Near the entryway, all the signs are in English, hawking wares like ice-cold, fresh-squeezed orange juice at premium prices to overheated tourists like me. As you walk further into the interior, however, the English language signage vanishes and the prices drop significantly. Plaza Catalunya is a very busy transportation hub that connects the older part of the city with Eixample, the extension or expansion, and an area we'll visit next. The area around the square is chock full of fountains, statues, restaurants, and shopping, including the enormous El Corte Inglés, which has its own restaurant and a food hall. We'll come back at the end of our walk. This square is enormous. It's one of the largest in Spain and covers more than 12 American acres. Of course, it requires a considerable amount of maintenance, seen here, to clean up the mess left behind, not just by pigeons, but also thoughtless humans. Among other things, this square was the site of numerous events during the Spanish Civil War. The story is too complicated for me to relate here, but no one comes out looking particularly good. If you look, you can still find bullet holes left over from a battle that took place here in the square. If you remember the African Queen, the Nazi colonel questioning Rick in his bar mentioned that Rick had fought on the side of the Republicans. One distinctly modern and definitely odd-looking memorial is to a man named Francesc Macià. This pile of stone is a set of upside-down steps meant to represent Catalonia's struggle for independence. The bust, barely visible in my photo, is of Macià himself, a politician and a soldier who had been exiled for his involvement in a separatist movement back in the 1920s. So you can see that the central Spanish government exiling people it perceives as enemies, particularly those supporting Catalan separatism, is nothing new. The current Spanish government has to contend with the ongoing separatist movement. I suspect it chafes at this memorial and wishes that it would just fall over. Once we go past the Plaza Catalunya, we find ourselves in an area called Eixample, and the name gives you a clue as to its design. The word means expansion in Catalan. The area is probably best known today for its Modernista architecture by men like Antoni Gaudí, Joseph Cadafalch, and Louis Dominici Montaner. Gaudí gets the most notice and is probably the best known for his stunning and still unfinished masterpiece, La Sagrada Familia, the Holy Family, his Casa Batlló, an apartment building known for its colorful facade, and a Casa Mila, also known as La Pradera, a massive building known for its undulating stonework and wrought iron balconies. I find the entire Modernista or Catalan modern architecture style absolutely fascinating. I also happen to enjoy Gothic architecture and can see how Modernista is a descendant of it. I have to admit, if you prefer your buildings plain or austere, this is not going to be your glass of vino tinto. But if you're open to decoration on what could be called an outrageous scale, you're going to love it. We'll visit this area in more detail in a future video blog, but for now, take a look at Gaudí's unfinished masterpiece, La Sagrada Familia. This is a Catholic church, not a cathedral, and is being built by private subscription. Like its Gothic predecessors, this wasn't built from a blueprint, or at least none that has ever been found. Gaudí apparently didn't like blueprints. He made models for what he wanted built, in addition to what he had in his head. In July 1936, anarchists from the FAI set fire to the crypt and broke their way into the workshop, partially destroying his original plans and models. We don't know how close the building we see today hews to his original intent, although once you look at some of his other projects, you can see how he or his successors have recycled his ideas. Park Güell was originally intended as a ritzy suburban housing development of about 60 individual homes. A wealthy Barcelonan industrialist named Eusebio Güell, who was one of Antoni Gaudí's main patrons, owned the land and hired Gaudí to design the development. He planned to move here. The plan failed and only 2 houses were ever built, although the ancillary infrastructure did go in. This wasn't what we'd call public housing either. It was intended for the rich or hoi polloi of the city and set up on a hill. There were fabulous views of the city from what is now the park, but it was too isolated for the intended residents, all of whom either had homes, businesses, or social lives centered in the city itself. Public transportation in those days didn't exist, and getting to the park, or back, then as now, was something of a nuisance and an adventure. Even today, the guidebooks all say, take a cab, but of course I was too cheap to do that. Public transportation doesn't get you very close. The bus, once it finally arrived, took about a half an hour, and you still had to walk a quarter of a mile to the main entrance of the park. I think that something like that in pre-air-conditioned Barcelona explains why the society ladies turned up their noses at this space. Park Güell might have failed as a residential project, but it's still one of Barcelona's most famous landmarks, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and very much worth visiting. We'll come back here in a future video blog. I had to change trains or catch a bus and generally pass through this area fairly frequently, so I became quite acquainted with El Corte Inglés. I'm not much of a window shopper, but even I was impressed. This is a famous Spanish department store chain, and it's the largest group in Europe. There are several branches in the city, much smaller, but this is the flagship store. You can find clothes, home goods, and a gourmet grocery store, as well as a top-floor cafeteria shown here. The restaurant is something really special, even for a department store restaurant. Up on the top floor, it might look like just a self-service cafeteria, but it reads rather more elegantly, has great food, ice water, and a knockout view if you manage to snag one of the window seats. The tab for my paella and a fair-sized glass of white wine was less than 13 euros, making it a bargain in this city, although I'm quite sure prices have gone up since my visit. After all, prices have gone up pretty much every place on the planet. I have to add that for cafeteria paella, it tasted very good. We've seen the basics of the city, walked uphill, found a good place for lunch and a place to rest our feet, so now it's time for me to say goodbye. Come back next time for another adventure with me, your armchair traveler, as your guide.